Myanmar is tradition-rich country, and she has a lot of folklores. Lots of children are listen those folklores as their bedtime story. I will be reading 30 Burmese tales written by Maung Htin Aung in this series. In this tale, I will be reading The Big Tortoise. Please subscribe and click the bell button to get notification when we upload new tales. Once there lived a fisherman and his wife, and they had a very beautiful daughter by the name of Mistress Youngest. The mother was very fond of the daughter, but the father was a little indifferent. One day the couple went out fishing in a boat, and for some hours the husband could not catch anything at all. He became very short-tempered, whereas his wife became anxious lest she should not be able to cook any fish for her daughter. After great trouble a fish was caught, and the wife cried, "This is for Mistress Youngest and not for sale." Another fish was caught, and again the wife cried out, "I reserve this for Mistress Youngest." Then another was caught, and the wife again cried out, "I claim this for Mistress Youngest." At this, the husband became very angry, and hit her with an oar, and she fell into the sea, and was transformed into a big tortoise. The fisherman of course thought that she was drowned. When he arrived back at his village, he simply said that his wife fell into the sea, and was drowned. Everybody assumed that it was all an unfortunate accident, and everyone felt sorry for the fisherman over his loss. After some time, the fisherman decided to marry again, and he chose as his spouse a hateful old witch. She was a widow and had a daughter by her first marriage. The daughter was a sour-tempered young woman with an ugly face made uglier by pock marks. Both the mother and the daughter were jealous of Mistress Youngest because she was so beautiful and kind, and between them they made her life a misery. They made her do all the household work, and they scolded her and jeered at her. The fisherman took no interest in Mistress Youngest and just left her to the tender mercies of his wife and stepdaughter. One afternoon Mistress Youngest felt so unhappy that she slipped out of her house and went to the seashore. There she sat down and cried her heart out. Presently she saw an old tortoise swimming towards her and, to her surprise, she saw that the old tortoise was crying also. Now she guessed that the old tortoise was her mother, and she took the animal in her arms. The tortoise, of course, could not speak to her, but it seemed so pleased to be with Mistress Youngest. So every afternoon Mistress Youngest came to the seashore and stayed with the tortoise until nightfall. After a few days the stepmother and the stepsister noticed that, in spite of their ill treatment, Mistress Youngest seemed happier than before, and also that she disappeared from the house every afternoon. So they followed her to the seashore and saw her sitting and talking to the tortoise. They were very furious that Mistress Youngest should have any friends, and they decided to deprive Mistress Youngest of her happy afternoons. The next morning the stepmother made a lot of crisp and dry pancakes, and put them under her bed. When her husband returned from his work in the afternoon the stepmother, pretending to be very ill, lay in bed. When she turned this way and that way, naturally the cakes underneath her made a crackling noise and she moaned repeatedly. "This side I turn, crackle, crackle. That side I turn, crackle, crackle. I die of splintered bones." The husband became so anxious that he rushed out and brought back the village physician. The physician had been bribed beforehand by the stepmother, so he looked at the patient, and said that it was a serious disease, but the remedy was easy. "Give her tortoise flesh at once," he prescribed, "and she will be all tight in no time." "How fortunate!" exclaimed the patient. "My daughter tells me that a big, fat tortoise comes to the shore every afternoon, and so my husband can easily go and catch it at once." Then the stepdaughter led the fisherman to the place where Mistress Youngest was sitting with the tortoise in her arms. The fisherman, in spite of the tearful entreaties for the animal's life on the part of Mistress Youngest, killed the tortoise at once, and ordered Mistress Youngest to cook it quickly for her stepmother. Poor Mistress Youngest! How she cried and cried in the kitchen as she prepared her stepmother's dinner. She was stricken with grief and the work was tiring. As the tortoise was an exceptionally big one, she had to wash more than 100 dishes to contain all the cooked flesh. At last all was ready, and the stepmother jumped up from bed, saying that the mere smell of the tortoise flesh had cured her. She invited her husband and daughter to share the meal with her. Out of sheer malice, she also invited Mistress Youngest who, of course, declined, saying that she was unwell. As there were so many dishes of tortoise flesh, the stepmother decided to send one dish to each neighbor, because her treatment of the gentle mistress youngest had made her unpopular with the neighbors and she wanted to become popular. So she ordered mistress youngest to take a dish to every cottage in the village with her compliments. At every cottage mistress youngest was asked, "What could we do to make you happy?" And she always replied, "Please eat the flesh, but do not throw away the bones. Please keep the bones in the eaves of your cottage, so that I can come and collect them without disturbing you." Late that night, she went from cottage to cottage and brought back the bones from the caves. Then she buried the bones just outside her cottage door, and she made this oath: "If I truly love my mother, may a tree of gold and silver fruit grow here to mark her grave." Early the next day, all the neighbors were surprised to see a wonderful tree which seemed to have grown overnight, right in front of the cottage of the fisherman. It was indeed a wonderful tree, for some of its fruits were of silver, and others were of gold. As the neighbors stood around and gaped at the tree, the king of the country passed by on his hunting elephant. "A gold and silver tree in this remote village," he said, "and who owns it?" The stepmother came out of the cottage and answered, "My daughter owns it, your majesty." "Call her here then," ordered the king, and the stepsister came forward. "Is that your tree?" asked the king. "Yes, your majesty," answered the stepsister. "If that is so, pluck your fruit and come with me," ordered the king. The stepsister climbed up the tree and, although she pulled with all her strength, the fruit could not be plucked. "I don't believe you own the tree," said the king with a frown, "and I wonder who is the real owner." "We think mistress youngest owns it, your majesty," said the neighbors. The king summoned mistress youngest to his presence and asked her to prove that the tree belonged to her. So mistress youngest sat under the tree and made this oath: "If this tree belongs to me, may all the fruits fall into my lap," and all the fruits fell into her lap. The king was very pleased, and took her away on his elephant to the capital where she was crowned as queen. The stepmother and the stepsister gnashed their teeth in anger and malice, and they cut down the tree out of sheer spite. After 4 or 5 months the stepmother and the stepsister thought of a plan to kill mistress youngest, and so they sent word to her, begging her to forgive them their past misdeeds and to come and stay with them for a few weeks. Mistress youngest was a very kind and trusting young woman, and she believed them. So, asking permission from her husband, the king, she went to the village, taking only a few retainers, and these few she sent back the moment she reached her father's cottage, as she did not want her old friends in the village to think that she had become conceited with so many servants and followers round her. Before the retainers went away, however, she instructed them to come back after 1 month. The stepmother and the stepsister were outwardly very sweet and loving to mistress youngest, but all the time they were waiting eagerly for an opportunity to kill her. One day, while sitting at dinner, the stepmother dropped a spoon down a hole in the kitchen flooring, and mistress youngest, ever dutiful and thinking that the spoon had been dropped accidentally, and went down to fetch it. When she was right underneath, the stepmother emptied a cauldron of boiling water over her, and poor mistress youngest was transformed into a white paddy bird which flew away swiftly. On the appointed day the retainers came back, and they were met by the wicked stepsister who was dressed up in the fine raiment of mistress youngest. "You are not our queen," they exclaimed indignantly. "I am," replied the stepsister, "but you cannot recognize me as I was attacked by the terrible disease of smallpox during your absence, and as a result my face is now disfigured." The retainers were rather dubious, but all the same they had to escort her back to the king. When she arrived at the palace, the king said in anger, "You are not mistress youngest, for your face is pock-marked," whereas her face was as fair as the lily. "My lord," replied the stepsister, "I was attacked by the terrible disease of smallpox." "Will you discard me just because I contracted the disease through no fault of my own?" "You cannot be mistress youngest," said the king, "for your forehead is high and ugly, unlike her beautiful forehead." "I missed you so much, my lord," replied the stepsister, "that I often cried, hitting my forehead against the floor, and it has now become swollen." "You cannot be mistress youngest," said the king, "for your nose is too long and ugly, so different from her beautiful nose." "My lord," replied the stepsister, "I missed you so much that I was always weeping, and I had to wipe my nose so many times. No wonder my nose has become long." The king, however, remained suspicious. Now mistress youngest was a wonderful weaver, and all the king's dresses were woven by her. Wanting to test the stepsister, he now asked her to weave a dress for him. The stepsister went to the weaving room, but as she was a fool with her hands, she sat at the loom in great fear lest her lack of skill in weaving should show that she was an impostor. But Mistress Youngest, in the form of the paddy bird, came to her rescue. For even as a bird, Mistress Youngest cared only for the happiness of her husband and wanted him to wear a fine dress. So the white paddy bird flew into the weaving room by the window and, seizing the spindle in her beak, she wove a dress of wonderful pattern. The stepsister watched the paddy bird in silence until it had finished weaving, and had dropped the spindle. Then she picked up the spindle and threw it at the paddy bird, who fell down dead. She picked up the dead bird and, calling the cook, ordered him to roast it. When the king came into the room in the evening, she showed him the dress, and said, "My lord, the dress would have been even better had not a white paddy bird come and interfered with my weaving." The king had to admit that the dress was well woven, but he remained wrapped in gloom, for he still suspected that the stepsister was an impostor. The king sat down to dinner and a servant brought in the roasted paddy bird. "What is this?" asked the king. "It is that interfering paddy bird," said the stepsister. "I killed it and had it roasted specially for you." "Poor little bird." "I don't wish to eat you," said the king, ordering his servant to take it away. The servant also felt sorry for the bird and, instead of eating it or throwing away, buried it behind the kitchen. The next day a big quince tree was seen growing behind the kitchen, and the stepsister, being suspicious of trees which grew overnight, made careful inquiries, but nobody could say how the tree came to be there. The servant of the previous night, however, guessed that the tree had something to do with the paddy bird, for the tree was growing out of the very place where he had buried the bird, but he did not say anything as he was frightened of the stepsister. An old man and his wife came to the palace kitchen to sell their firewood. After selling it, they rested under the big quince tree, and a big quince fruit fell into the woman's lap. "Lucky it did not fall on our heads," they laughed. They picked up the fruit meaning to eat it in the evening, but when they reached their home, the woman thought that it was not ripe enough yet to be eaten. So she put it away in an earthen jar meaning to eat it a few days later. Early next morning the couple went out as usual to gather firewood, and as usual they returned at breakfast time. They were astonished to find that in their absence the cottage had been swept clean, and the meal cooked. They looked everywhere, but could not find any trace of the stranger who had so kindly tidied up the cottage and cooked the meal. The next morning the same thing happened. "I will solve the mystery tomorrow," whispered the old man to his wife that night, "for I have thought of a plan." Long before the first streak of daylight appeared, the old man got up from bed, and giving a nudge with his elbow to his wife, he cried loudly, "You old lazybones, get up, and let us go earlier than usual, so that we can gather more firewood." The old woman, realizing that her husband wanted all the world to think that they were going out, said loudly in reply, "You are the lazybones, for I am ready to go out now." They went out of their cottage shouting and pretending to quarrel, but after they had gone half a mile, they came back stealthily in the darkness and, entering their cottage silently, they hid behind the door to watch. When the sun had risen they saw a tiny little woman come out of the earthen jar, and run into the kitchen. "It is a fruit maiden," whispered the old woman, "and I know how to catch her." So saying, she fetched one of her skirts, and spreading it, she stood by the jar. Then she gave a shout, which frightened the little fruit maiden, who now came running towards the jar. The old woman threw the skirt over the fruit maiden, and Mistress Youngest stood before them. "You are our queen," they said, recognizing her, "and we must take you to our lord the king." At first Mistress Youngest refused, as she did not want her stepsister to get into trouble, but in the end she agreed, as she wanted to see her husband again so badly. The king and the stepsister were giving an audience to the courtiers when the old couple entered with Mistress Youngest. The king was very pleased to see Mistress Youngest again, but he was not too surprised at her return, for he had always suspected that the stepsister was an impostor. "But I am Mistress Youngest," protested the stepsister, "and this woman is an impostor and a witch. She has bewitched you all to make you think that she is I." "She is the true Mistress Youngest," said the old couple, who then proceeded to relate how they had found Mistress Youngest. "Didn't I tell you?" shouted the stepsister in triumph. "A fruit maiden, and a witch I should say." Mistress Youngest then told the king how she was first transformed into a paddy bird, and then into a fruit maiden. I demand that the custom of the people should be followed in this case, exclaimed the stepsister, and I demand a trial by ordeal. Now in a trial by ordeal, the parties to a dispute had to fight a duel with swords, but, whereas the defendant was allowed to fight with an iron sword, the plaintiff had to use a wooden one, for on the plaintiff was the burden of proof, and it was assumed that, if justice was really on his side, he would win in spite of the fact that his sword was wooden. But the stepsister had no faith in a trial by ordeal, and she thought that she would be able to kill Mistress Youngest with one stroke of her iron sword. The king and his courtiers were certain that the stepsister was an impostor, and did not want to put Mistress Youngest to the ordeal, but what could they do? For even the king was not above the customary law of the people, and the stepsister's demand was a legitimate one. The king now ordered that the two swords be brought, and the wooden one given to Mistress Youngest, for she was the plaintiff and it was for her to prove her case. Mistress Youngest faced her stepsister, and made this oath: if I am really Mistress Youngest, may my stepsister's sword become harmless to me. So she stood there calmly, making no attempt to use her wooden sword, while the stepsister hewed and hacked at her with the iron sword. But Mistress Youngest remained unscathed, for the iron sword became as soft as velvet whenever it touched her body. Suddenly, the wooden sword, of its own accord, slipped out of Mistress Youngest's hand and cut off the stepsister's head. The king decided that the stepmother should be made to suffer also, although Mistress Youngest pleaded for her pardon. Accordingly he gave orders that the dead body of the stepsister be first cut into pieces, and then put into a jar and pickled. Afterwards he sent the jar to the stepmother with a message that it was a special gift of pickled fish made by the queen herself. The old stepmother was so proud of the royal gift that she asked her husband to come and taste the pickle at once. As she served out spoonful after spoonful, she kept chattering about her dear daughter, the queen, until the husband lost his temper and said, "Woman, don't talk rubbish, but eat on." The stepmother took out another spoonful from the jar, and cried out in alarm, "This looks like a human finger, my daughter's finger." "Don't talk rubbish," said the irate husband, "but eat on." She took out another spoonful and cried out in alarm, "This looks like a human toe, my daughter's toe." "Don't talk rubbish," said the irate husband, "but eat on." The stepmother peeped into the jar to see whether there was any pickle left, and she saw at the bottom the pock-marked face of her daughter. "It is my daughter, it is my daughter," she wailed. At this the husband got up and beat her soundly for talking nonsense. That is the end of the tale, The Big Tortoise. Read by me, Emma, Timber Music Channel. Please subscribe and click the bell button to get notification when we upload new tales.